If you ever asked me about my childhood, I'd probably laugh first, just to hide the ache in my chest. My name is Emma Hayes, and sometimes it feels like I was born tired. My earliest memories are filled with the sound of my mother's voice calling me to hurry up, the creak of our ancient front door, and the chill that always seemed to linger in the corners of our small house. We lived on the south side of Boston, Massachusetts, in a cramped two-bedroom house squeezed between rows of other tired, sagging homes. Our street was a patchwork of broken sidewalks and weedy lawns, with rusted bikes chained to fences and children's voices echoing through the alleys. My parents, Margaret and Joseph Hayes, always said we were lucky to have a roof over our heads. And maybe they were right. But sometimes I wondered what it would be like to wake up somewhere with bright windows and soft carpets and space to breathe. There was never quite enough of anything in our house, never enough food, never enough warmth, and certainly never enough money. Most weeks, we lived on the edge, stretching $20 as far as we could, buying bags of potatoes, loaves of day-old bread, and boxes of cheap macaroni. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, counting coins with my mother, both of us pretending it was a game so my little heart wouldn't crack with worry. Sometimes, if my father managed to pick up extra shifts at the garage, we'd splurge on a pack of cookies or a carton of milk, and those small luxuries felt like treasures. My parents tried their best, or at least that's what I believed back then. In our neighborhood, almost everyone was fighting the same battle. I grew up surrounded by people who worked too hard for too little, mothers with tired eyes and fathers with calloused hands, and children who learned early not to ask for more than what was possible. My parents had 1,000 stories about better days, but the present was always hard. My father worked as a mechanic at a rundown shop off Dorchester Avenue, fixing engines for less than they were worth. Sometimes he'd come home late with grease still under his fingernails, shoulders hunched from exhaustion. My mother cleaned offices at night, and on weekends, she'd take in laundry from the neighbors, scrubbing stains out by hand in our cramped bathroom. I think they both hoped for more, but the years had worn them down. When bills piled up, tempers ran high. There were nights I heard them arguing behind closed doors, their voices sharp and desperate, but by morning they'd paste on brave faces for my sake. By the time I was 14, it was clear that I needed to help. I started cleaning houses for neighbors after school, dusting shelves, washing windows, mopping floors. The pay was never much, but every dollar counted. My parents insisted that my earnings go into a chipped ceramic jar in the kitchen, our rainy day fund. Looking back, I realized that the rain never really stopped. The jar was always empty by the end of the week. I'd come home with aching feet and chapped hands, and my mother would smile at me with a mix of pride and apology that I didn't understand until I was older. Things changed when I turned 16. I'd saved up just enough to buy a battered monthly subway pass, and suddenly the city felt bigger, full of possibilities I'd never seen before. I started taking the red line across the river, into neighborhoods I'd only glimpsed from the windows of my father's car, places like Beacon Hill and Back Bay, where the houses were the size of palaces, surrounded by high hedges and iron gates. On my first day working on the other side of Boston, I stood outside a house with 4 stories and a garden bigger than our entire block, and I couldn't help but stare. The front door opened, and the woman who answered looked at me as if I'd brought the city's grime in on my shoes. She handed me a list of chores and left me alone in a sea of marble and glass. Those first few weeks were overwhelming. Everything in those houses felt delicate and expensive, as if I could break it just by breathing wrong. I learned to move quietly, to keep my eyes down, and to work as quickly as I could. Some days I cleaned 6 or 7 rooms, bathrooms tiled in Italian marble, kitchens gleaming with stainless steel appliances, bedrooms with sheets softer than anything I'd ever touched. It was hard not to imagine what it would be like to live in a place like that, to have warm floors under my feet and sunlight pouring through the windows. But that life belonged to other people, people who would never know what it felt like to choose between heating the house and buying groceries. The money was a little better in those rich neighborhoods, but it disappeared just as quickly. Some weeks, after paying for groceries and rent, there was nothing left. Other times, I managed to put a $5 bill aside in a shoebox hidden under my bed. I dreamed of saving enough for something special, a college application, maybe, or a real winter coat, but I never told my parents. They had enough to worry about, and besides, they always needed the money more than I did. If my father lost a day of work or my mother got sick, my small savings would vanish in a heartbeat. Sometimes, as I scrubbed the floors of those grand houses, I'd listen to the sound of laughter drifting down from upstairs children. My age or younger, carefree and oblivious. It hurt in ways I couldn't explain. I tried not to envy them, but it was impossible not to wonder why their lives were so different from mine. Still, I worked hard, kept my head down, and tried to be invisible. That was the only way to survive. Looking back, I realize how much of my childhood was spent waiting for payday, waiting for my parents to come home, waiting for something to change. I never imagined that one of those houses, with its golden doorknobs and echoing hallways, would change my life forever. But as it turned out, fate was already turning its wheels quietly on the other side of the city. All I knew was that I was just a poor girl from Boston, struggling to hold my world together with small hands and big dreams, never suspecting that my real story hadn't even begun. I still remember that Tuesday morning in Boston like a bruise that never really faded. It was one of those days when the sky seemed to press down on the city, heavy and gray, the kind of day when even the air felt wet and sad. I left the house before sunrise, the cold nipping at my ankles as I hurried down our block to the bus stop, my thin coat doing nothing to keep out the dampness. My parents had been fighting again the night before, voices sharp enough to cut glass, and I'd barely slept. I carried their anger and my worries with me as I took the first bus, and then the second, trying not to think about how much depended on my job that day. The Lawrence mansion stood in sharp contrast to the world I came from, a white stone palace set back from the street, surrounded by manicured hedges and tall iron gates that gleamed even on cloudy days. I'd only started cleaning there 2 weeks before, but every time I stepped through their front door, I felt smaller, as if the house itself was judging me. Inside, everything was gleaming and spotless, all polished marble and shining brass. Even the air smelled expensive, something floral and sharp that clung to my skin long after I left. Blair Lawrence, the lady of the house, was as beautiful as she was cold. She was tall and elegant, her blonde hair always perfectly styled. Her lips painted a deep red that seemed more like a warning than an invitation. She never looked at me, never really saw me at all. Her voice was always clipped and precise, her orders coming fast and sharp as if she thought I might disappear at any moment if she didn't keep me in line. I knew her reputation around Boston, a woman who had clawed her way into the city's old money circles, who guarded her position like a hawk. I also knew that she went through housekeepers the way some people go through napkins. I was determined not. "Are you completely useless?" she shrieked, her face twisted in fury. "Look at what you've done. This is a designer dress. You've ruined it, you little idiot." Her words hit me harder than the slap, each one a blow to my pride, my heart, the small bit of hope I still carried. I tried to explain, my voice shaking, but she wasn't interested in apologies. She grabbed me by the arm, her nails digging into my skin, and dragged me through the hallway toward the front door. I barely had time to grab my old, patched purse before she shoved me out onto the stone steps. Rain drizzled from the sky, cold and mean, soaking through my thin clothes in seconds. Blair stood in the doorway, glaring at me as if I were something she'd scraped off her shoe. "Get out," she spat. "You're fired, and don't you dare come back." The door slammed shut, and I was left standing in the rain, my hair plastered to my forehead, and my hands trembling. For a long minute, I just stood there, stunned. The pain in my cheek faded beneath a wave of panic. How was I going to tell my parents I'd lost another job? I thought of my father's disappointed sigh, my mother's sharp words, and the rent that would be due at the end of the week. I tried so hard to hold everything together, and now it felt like I'd failed all over again. I sank onto the cold stone steps, hugging my knees to my chest as tears slid down my face, mixing with the rain. I didn't care if anyone saw me. I was too tired to hide how broken I felt. The world seemed to move on around me, cars gliding by, distant laughter. The city's heart still beating while mine felt like it was breaking apart. I thought about just walking home, but the idea of facing my parents' disappointment made my feet feel like lead. I stayed there, shivering, until I heard the soft growl of an engine behind me. A sleek black Mercedes rolled to a stop at the curb. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, trying to compose myself, but it was no use. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, with silver hair and a kind of presence that made you look twice. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes shining even in the rain. He looked expensive. Everything about him did, but it was the way he looked at me that made me freeze. His eyes were wide with something like shock, but also a deep, searching sadness, as if he were seeing a ghost. He stood there for a long moment, just studying me. I felt exposed, like he could see all the things I tried so hard to hide, my fear, my shame, my hunger for something better. Finally he spoke, his voice low and gentle. "Are you all right?"
he asked, and there was real concern in his eyes.
It was the first kindness I'd been shown all day. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak.
He didn't move, just waited as if he knew I needed a moment.
For reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself wanting to tell him everything, the pain, the fear, the endless struggle. But I stayed silent, just holding his gaze as the rain softened around us. He looked at me for another moment, then reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, offering it to me without a word. That small gesture, so simple and human, was enough to make my tears start all over again. At that moment, I had no idea how much this stranger would change my life. All I knew was that I was lost, alone, and standing on the edge of something I couldn't yet understand. The ride in Richard Bennett's car was the strangest I'd ever experienced. And not just because I'd never sat in a car so fine before. The interior was all soft black leather and faint perfume, nothing at all like the cracked vinyl and stale cigarette smell of my father's pickup. Rain trickled down the windows, blurring the city into gray streaks. Richard sat quietly behind the wheel, glancing at me from time to time with an expression I couldn't read. I tried to smooth my wet hair and wipe away any sign that I'd been crying. But I could feel my face was still blotchy and swollen. He didn't rush me though, and that made me even more nervous. People in my world always seemed to want me gone as soon as possible. Customers at the corner store, teachers at school, and even sometimes my parents. But Richard's calm, measured way made me feel as if he truly saw me. He didn't talk much at first. Instead, he let me ride in silence, and only when we passed the city's edge did he finally speak. "Emma," he said, so gently it almost startled me. "How long have you worked for the Lawrence family?" I hesitated, not sure why he cared. "Only a couple of weeks," I admitted. It was supposed to be a good job, at least that's what my mom said. But I guess I messed it up, I always do.
He didn't correct me or fill the silence with empty reassurances. Instead he asked, "Where do you live?"
And I found myself blurting out the street name before I could think. As soon as I realized, I felt a wave of embarrassment. Was I really about to let a stranger drive me all the way home? But something in his eyes, a softness I hadn't seen in anyone in a long time, made me trust him against all my instincts. The drive to my house seemed to take longer than usual. Maybe because I was acutely aware of every bump in the road, every awkward minute that passed. We didn't speak much, but the questions in his eyes made my skin prickle. When we finally pulled up to our shabby little house, I saw it as he must have: peeling paint, weeds curling up from the cracked sidewalk, the porch sagging under years of neglect. My stomach twisted with shame. Richard got out first, opening my door as if I were someone important. I wanted to shrink away, but he just smiled softly and said, "Let's go see your family." His words were simple, but there was something in them that made my heart beat faster. My mother opened the door when she heard us approach, her face pinched with suspicion the moment she saw Richard at my side. My father loomed behind her, arms folded tight as if trying to block the view of our tired living room. Their eyes flicked from Richard's expensive suit to my red, swollen face and wet clothes. Richard introduced himself smoothly, as if he was used to entering strangers' homes. "Good afternoon. My name is Richard Bennett. I found your daughter outside my friend's house and she seemed upset. I just wanted to be sure she got home safe." He spoke with a calm assurance as if he were someone used to being listened to, but my mother's eyes narrowed even further. "We appreciate it," she said, her tone stiff and guarded. "Emma's always coming home late. You didn't have to trouble yourself." Richard looked at me, then at them, his gaze lingering. "She's a hard worker," he said, and I almost smiled at the kindness in his voice. He asked, almost casually, "Is Emma your only child?" My mother glanced at my father for just a second so quickly anyone else would have missed it, but I saw it. Her mouth tightened. "Of course," she said, voice steady. "We've raised her since she was a baby. She's always been ours." Richard nodded, but I could see he was studying them, weighing their words. The air was thick with something I didn't understand, as if the three adults in the room were all keeping secrets from each other. My father only grunted, avoiding Richard's eyes. There was an awkward pause, and then Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to my mother, who hesitated before taking it. I could see the familiar hunger in her eyes. Money was rare in our house, and any amount, especially the crisp new bills inside, would be welcome. "Please," Richard said, "just a small token for your trouble." I saw how hard Emma was working. "I'd like her to have a little something extra." He didn't say how much was in the envelope, but later I saw my mother's hand trembling as she counted $200. It was more than I'd made in a month. Richard turned to me before he left. He put his hand on my shoulder, gentle, reassuring, and said quietly, "Take care of yourself, Emma. I'll be in touch." The way he looked at me, so deeply and with so much longing, sent a chill through me, but not an unpleasant one. It was as if he was memorizing my face. As his car disappeared down the street, my parents wasted no time. My father glared at me, asking what I'd done to deserve money from a man like that. My mother stuffed the bills into her purse and told me not to talk about it to anyone, not that there was anyone I could talk to. That night, as I lay awake in my tiny bedroom, I replayed everything over and over in my mind. Who was Richard Bennett, really? Why did he seem so shocked to see me? Why had he gone out of his way to bring me home and give my family money? For the first time, I wondered if my parents were hiding something from me, something bigger than just being poor, something that had to do with who I was. I didn't know then that Richard Bennett was a man with a wound in his heart, a daughter who had disappeared 16 years ago, a case that had haunted the police and the press, a photograph he still carried in his wallet. He didn't tell me that he'd felt hope for the first time in years the moment he saw my face. In my world, secrets always seemed to be about survival. But this was different. I could feel it deep in my bones, even though I didn't understand it yet. Something in my life was about to change forever, and the quiet man with the sad eyes would be the one to unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. I have relived that day in my mind so many times, it sometimes feels like it belonged to someone else. But every memory, every sound, every word, every look still belongs to me. That morning started like any other, with me waking up before dawn, slipping quietly out of my tiny bedroom so I wouldn't wake my parents. They had been in a sour mood ever since Richard Bennett's visit, whispering to each other behind closed doors, watching me with strange expressions I'd never seen before. But nothing about my life had changed. I was still Emma Hayes, the girl who cleaned houses and carried the weight of her family's disappointment on her back. I had managed to pick up a few hours at the Whitmore estate, a sprawling brick mansion on the edge of Boston. Not far from the Lawrence place, Mrs. Whitmore was an old friend of Blair Lawrence, and just as sharp and cold, though she paid a little better and never bothered to learn my name. That day, she barely looked up when I arrived, just pointed me toward the dining room, and told me to polish the silver before her guests arrived for lunch. I worked in silence, my hands moving almost automatically over the spoons and forks, trying not to think about the sting on my cheek from Blair's slap just days before, or the strange, hollow ache I carried with me after Richard Bennett's visit. I wondered what he was doing, if he had really meant what he said about being in touch, or if I would never see him again. It was almost noon when I heard the heavy front door open, the sound of footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. At first, I thought it was one of Mrs. Whitmore's friends, and I braced myself for the usual coldness, but when I glanced up, my heart leaped in my chest. There, standing just inside the doorway, was Richard Bennett. He looked different, somehow more determined, maybe even angry, but when his eyes found mine, I saw only sadness and hope tangled together. Mrs. Whitmore swept into the room, her heels tapping like gunshots. When she saw me standing with Richard, her face twisted with irritation. "What is she doing here?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. She turned to Richard, her lips pressed in a thin line. "I hope you know that girl is nothing but trouble. I've heard stories." She's a liar and a thief if you ask me." Before I could open my mouth, before I could even flinch, Richard stepped between us, his voice loud and unwavering. "That's my daughter you're talking about, Margaret." The words hung in the air, echoing off the chandelier. Everyone stopped. Even Mrs. Whitmore looked stunned. Time seemed to stand still. I stared at Richard, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what he had just said. Daughter? Me? I looked at Mrs. Whitmore, who took a step back, her face suddenly pale. Richard turned to me, and in his eyes I saw the truth, a deep, bone-deep certainty. He stepped forward and pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in my life, I felt the kind of embrace that doesn't just hold your body but your heart. He whispered, "Emma, I found you. I knew the moment I saw you." Tears flooded my eyes, and I let myself collapse into him, my hands shaking as I clung to his suit jacket. All my life, I had craved kindness and yearned for a feeling of belonging. I never dreamed it would come in such a sudden, shocking way. Still holding me, Richard explained. He told me about his daughter, Charlotte Bennett, stolen from her crib when she was just 2 years old. He showed me a worn photo from his wallet, a baby girl with big, brown eyes and a soft smile. "I never stopped looking," he said, his voice trembling. "Every day, every year, I waited for you to come home." He explained how he'd secretly taken a hair from my old hairbrush the day he brought me home, how he'd sent it for a DNA test. "The results were undeniable," he said. "You are Charlotte. You are my daughter." For a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind was a storm of questions and disbelief, but the warmth in his eyes, and the way he said my name, made me believe in miracles. Mrs. Whitmore, for once, was speechless. She stammered a half-hearted apology and hurried from the room, leaving us alone. Later that afternoon, Richard took me in his car once again. My hands trembled as I watched the familiar streets slide by. I asked 1,000 questions, none of which he could fully answer. How had this happened? Why me? What would happen to the people I had called my parents? We arrived at my house. The police were already waiting, blue lights flashing in the driveway. My mother stood on the porch, arms crossed, her face pale and tight with fear. My father hovered behind her, silent and defeated. Richard walked straight up to them, his posture firm but not cruel. He asked them directly, "Why did you do it? Why did you take my daughter?" My mother's voice cracked as she tried to defend herself. She talked about longing for a child, about seeing me alone in a park and deciding I was meant to be hers. My father barely spoke, just looked at his feet. The truth poured out in broken sentences and sobs, the desperate, selfish act that had changed both their lives and mine forever. The police arrested them, reading them their rights as I watched from the sidewalk, numb and shivering. I wanted to feel anger, but all I felt was sorrow for the people I had loved and for myself, the girl who never really belonged. Richard stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, steady as a lighthouse. "You're coming home, Charlotte," he said softly. "We'll go slow. We'll find our way together." For the first time, I let myself believe it. I was no longer just Emma Hayes, the poor girl who cleaned houses. I was Charlotte Bennett, a daughter found and a family restored. My old life was gone, swept away in a flood of truth and tears. My future for the first time was wide open. Now, as I tell this story, I know it's not just mine, it's proof that even the smallest, saddest life can change in a heartbeat. That the truth, no matter how long it hides, will always find its way home. And that sometimes, when you least expect it, you finally become who you were always meant to be.